Who is Steve Bannon, and just how much influence has he had over President Trump? Joshua Green will be here to talk about his new book, The Devil's Bargain.
Sessions is a pivotal figure in the rise of Donald Trump, and the way he came into Trump's orbit was through Steve Bannon.
What's the long-term cost of being silent about pedophilia? Alexandria Marzano-Lesnevich will be here to talk about her new book, The Fact of a Body, a Murder and a Memoir.
In that moment, despite what I believed and despite what I wanted to spend my life doing, fighting the death penalty, in that moment I wanted Ricky Langley to die.
Who is the man behind Walden and civil disobedience? Laura Dassow Walls will be here to talk about her new biography, Henry David Thoreau, A Life.
Ralph Waldo Emerson had moved in just down the street, this commanding intellectual figure, and Thoreau had already begun to imagine himself as potentially a commanding intellectual figure.
Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Joshua Green joins us now from Washington. His new book is getting a lot of attention. It's called Devil's Bargain, Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, and the Storming of the Presidency. Josh, thanks so much for being here.
It's great to be with you.
So when did you first hear of Steve Bannon?
I first heard of Steve Bannon when a film publicist called me up in 2011. I'd just gotten back from Alaska and had written a big profile of Sarah Palin in the Atlantic where I used to work. And the publicist said, hey, I represent this filmmaker, and he really liked your article on Palin. Would you come see a movie that he's done on Palin at a sound studio in Arlington, Virginia, across the river here? And because it was 2011 and because we political reporters thought that Palin was going to run for president in 2012, I shrugged and I thought, yeah, sure, I'll go see your film. So I showed up the next day. There's this kind of scrubby-looking guy in a military field jacket who's got this kind of manic charisma, and it was Steve Bannon. And, he sat me down and showed me his documentary movie on Sarah Palin, which was not very good, I didn't think. It was sort of modeled on the Soviet propaganda films of the 1920s and 30s. But Bannon and I talked afterward, and he was instantly this kind of vivid character, this charismatic outsider guy who claimed to have gone, from Goldman Sachs to business school to Hollywood to running a video game company in Hong Kong to now being an intimate of Sarah Palin and having made this movie. And I kind of walked away thinking, that's an odd guy, but he's very interesting, and I guess I'll stay in touch and see if he can help me with my Palin reporting. And while I didn't write about his Palin movie, it became clear right away that Bannon was one of the leaders of what was then considered Tea Party politics and was trying very hard to get Sarah Palin to run for president. She didn't, but Bannon and I stayed in touch anyway.
And was your relationship kind of friendly at that point?
Yeah, I would say it was very friendly. I mean, my day job is as a political feature writer for Businessweek magazine, and so I'm always looking for vivid, larger-than-life characters to try and get away from the dull, orthodox talking point Washington that usually predominates. And Bannon was a guy who broke the mold, was almost larger than life, didn't really seem to kind of fit into the Washington world, which made him interesting to me. And it also became clear pretty early on that he meant it, that he really did believe in this idea of like a nationalist populism, and that it had some influence among the Republican grassroots voters. If you're in my job and you're eyeballing, the upcoming presidential race, what you do is you travel to places like Iowa and New Hampshire, and you go to these conservative conferences, these little cattle calls, where candidates come out and talk to the activists. And I could tell that the Bannon brand of populism, the kind of angry, anti-immigrant, our lunch is getting eaten by foreigners message, was resonating with a lot of the voters. And once Trump linked up with Bannon and Trump became the vessel for that, it really took off in a way that I didn't expect.
But back in 2011, when you first got to know him, did you think this is sort of one of these interesting, oddball, kind of fringe characters? Or could you imagine that he would end up in such a position of power?
There's a particular type of Washington grifter who is a fast-talking huckster and kind of gloms on to whatever the newest political trend is. And at the time, it was the idea of the Tea Party. And so you had what are known in Washington as scam packs, these consultants who'd kind of come down. They had a good sales pitch and they'd raise money, but they didn't really do anything. They were kind of in it for themselves. I thought that that's what Bannon was up to, but it wasn't. He really believed the stuff. He wasn't looking to make a buck. At one point, just sort of for the heck of it, I called a contact at Goldman Sachs and asked them, did a guy named Steve Bannon really work there in the 80s? And it turned out that he did, and the story checked out. What was interesting to me about Bannon, though, really wasn't so much the politics, it's just the character. I mean, he's a fun guy to be around in those days. He had a lot of charisma. He's a big networker. He's a former investment banker, and those guys talk and make deals and introduce people. So it was kind of fun to be in his slipstream going around at these conservative conferences.
It's interesting because you say in those days, and yet it was only 6 years ago. Has he evolved since then? Has he changed since that sort of fun guy from 2011?
Bannon hasn't changed a bit from 2011. He's under a lot more stress these days, I'm sure. But his politics have been consistent. What has changed is the candidate that he's getting behind. At first it was Palin. Then it was Michelle Bachmann, the former Tea Party congressman who fleetingly led the Republican polls in 2012, but that didn't really work out. And I remember him telling me very early on, this would have been in 2012, that he'd actually been up in Trump Tower talking to Donald Trump, and he kind of laughed about it. And I said, well, what were you doing talking to Donald Trump? And it turns out he'd been brought up there by David Bossie, a longtime conservative activist, and I sort of tell the story of their meeting in the book. Bossie knew Trump. Trump was getting serious about politics, and so he wanted to have, quote unquote, real political people come up and tutor him about politics. So one day, Bossie brought Bannon up to Trump Tower, and Trump had asked him to put together a little dossier. What do I need to know? And so Bannon tells me the story where they went out and did the most cursory kind of political research that like an intern in a campaign would do. You go out and you check someone's voting record to see if they voted. And you go and look to see who they donated money to. And Bannon and Bossie show up in Trump Tower and they say, well, look, here's what we know about you. You voted once in the last 20 primaries and you voted for a Democrat. Mm-hmm. That's going to be a problem for you. And you've given money to Democrats and that's going to be a problem. And Trump sort of looked amazed and said, how do you know these things about me? Not recognizing that these are public records that you could probably find on your phone. So he took Bannon seriously right away as not only a guy with a kind of an ideology, but also as someone who was very sophisticated about electoral politics, which in fact Bannon was not.
Bannon is one of these characters who, even though he's been in the headlines now for a couple of years, I think a lot of people think like, well, who is this guy still? Like, where did he come from? How did he become this? How good a sense do you have of him as a person, and what was his early life like?
The reason I wrote the book is sort of twofold. One was just to kind of explain what really happened in the election on the inside, but the other reason why was because I felt like I really knew Steve Bannon in a way that most reporters didn't, because for most people, Bannon didn't really kind of matter and come on the scene until August of 2016 when he took over the Trump campaign. What drew me to Bannon originally as a magazine feature subject was the fact that he's this Zelig-like figure who, he was in the Navy in the 1970s, in the late 1970s, so he was involved in the Iran hostage crisis. He was over in the Gulf during that failed effort, and that sort of radicalized him and made him a Reagan Republican. He was in Washington in the early 80s working in the Pentagon, under Reagan's Pentagon, when the Reagan Revolution swept through. He got bored. Bannon has a very short attention span, and hopped to Harvard Business School and Goldman Sachs. And so he was an investment banker in Goldman Sachs in the go-go 80s, and then moved out to Hollywood and kind of the Wild West of 90s Hollywood and did that for a while. So he's a guy with a strange and varied background that you don't normally see in a place like Washington. And I think that's one of the reasons why he wound up with Trump. No self-respecting Republican consultant would have anything to do with Donald Trump in 2011, 2012, 2013. Because he was considered a clown and a buffoon, and someone who's really only involving himself in politics to goose his apprentice ratings. but B, because beginning in 2011, Trump launched this birther attack against President Obama, the kind of racist slur that, Obama was born in Kenya and was a secret Muslim. If you're a Republican consultant in 2011, 2012, your biggest concern is the fact that the base of your party is composed primarily of elderly white people, rural people, working class people. And demographically, that is not a segment that's growing. The segment that's growing are minorities, young people, women. And so Republicans wanted desperately to put forward a more appealing face. And Trump was like poison to that campaign for the Republican Party to modernize. So he didn't really have a lot of people to choose from besides fringy people like David Bossie and Steve Bannon.
I want to go back to early Bannon because you mentioned in his trajectory that that Reagan sort of brought him over, that he was one of those Reagan Republicans. Did he grow up in a Democratic household? What was his political evolution like?
Bannon was born to an Irish Catholic Democratic working class family in Richmond, Virginia. His dad was a telephone linesman for AT&T for I think 40 years. And he went to a very conservative Catholic military academy in Richmond called Benedictine High School. He wasn't very political growing up. I talked to some of his Benedictine classmates. What he was, though, was a deeply conservative, traditional-minded Catholic. His family actually are Tridentine Catholics. They go to the Latin Mass and are very serious about that. Bannon was a nominal Democrat throughout high school and college and into the Navy. But once he got billeted aboard this Navy destroyer and wound up in the Gulf during the Iran hostage siege, he became radicalized, I think, both against Democrats because he was so angry at Jimmy Carter for the failure of the mission to try and rescue the American hostages in Iran, but even more so because there was something frightening and foreboding to him about Muslims, about Islam. This is a thread that runs through his life. And so he describes to me in the book getting off the Navy ship in Pakistan and feeling as though he'd stepped back into the 5th century. He described it as absolutely primeval and menacing, and here are all these young Muslims who are intensely anti-American, and he thought it was a threat. And one of the things I tried to do in my research is figure out what exactly are the roots of Bannon's Islamophobia. I mean, it seems so intense and almost hysterical. And I interviewed one of his classmates who went to the Roman Catholic Military Academy. And he said, well, look, we had a very traditional Western civ curriculum there. We were taught that Catholicism has always been under threat by the forces of Islam. We learned as juniors that Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs in Spain, had kind of, saved Christendom by fighting off the Moors, the Muslims, 500 years ago. And so, Bannon's mindset is always that, our religion, our country, our identity is being threatened by Islam. And if you flash forward to the September 11th attacks, in Bannon's mind, this was just an extension of what he'd seen in the Iranian hostage crisis. And then they were attacking America in the Middle East. Now they were attacking America in New York, and not just in New York, but in the very Wall Street neighborhood where he toiled for Goldman Sachs. And I think it flipped the switch in Bannon because it was not long after that having made, I think at least several $1 million in investment banking, he started making his own documentary movies, which have these kind of vivid, frightening scenes of Islam threatening America. And he moved from movies into the world, the kind of underworld of this populist right-wing politics at Breitbart News. And that is the path that connected him with Donald Trump and eventually led him to the White House.
Let's talk about the most recent headlines in which Bannon plays a role that you describe in the book. Trump gave an interview to the New York Times this week about many things, but in part about Jeff Sessions. And you write in the book that Bannon was the one who persuaded Sessions to be the first U.S. senator to publicly endorse Trump. Can you talk a little bit about that and sort of what you make of this latest development?
Absolutely. Sessions is a pivotal figure in the rise of Donald Trump. And the way he came into Trump's orbit was through Steve Bannon. In 2011, 2012, when Bannon took over Breitbart News and had this idea of populist nationalism, what he didn't have was a lot of elected officials in Congress who believed in what he believed in. There really was only one, and that was Jeff Sessions, the Alabama senator who considers himself an agrarian populist. And he and Bannon hit it off right away. Sessions' chief staffer was a young guy named Stephen Miller. Miller is now a White House official, but he is a virulently anti-immigrant activist, Miller is, and helped Sessions and Bannon kind of develop this politics that focuses on the alleged, menace of illegal immigration and the need to deport undocumented immigrants, reduce legal immigration. So Sessions and Bannon were in league long before Trump came on the scene. But once Trump announced his candidacy and began to rise in the polls, Bannon went to work trying to connect the two. The thing that Trump lacked, we tend to forget this now, or even at least I do, is that even when Trump was winning New Hampshire, winning South Carolina, winning these early polls, there were no national Republican elected officials who would endorse him. And I think Bannon understood that in order for the rest of the Republican Party to come around to Trump, he needed to get some of these people in. And so he lobbied Sessions for months to try and get him to endorse Trump. Bannon had tried to get Sessions to run for president 2 years earlier just to advance these issues, and he passed. And so there's a scene in the book where Sessions essentially says, okay, I know I need to do this. And he flies out to the Memphis airport in secret to meet Trump. Trump's about to have this big rally, and nobody knows that Sessions is going to come. And on the morning of the rally, Sessions is sitting in his rental car thinking to himself, if I endorse this and Trump loses, it's really going to cost me my standing in the Republican Party. And he'd already been passed over, Sessions had, for an important committee chairmanship because people thought he was too anti-immigrant and so on. And so Bannon gets on the phone with him and basically lobbies him for an hour. You've got to do this. This is our moment. And so finally Sessions says, okay, I'll do it. He walks out on stage in what became a famous video clip, whips out a Make America Great Again baseball cap, puts it on, and 2 days later, Donald Trump sweeps the Republican primary all across the South and essentially becomes the inevitable Republican nominee.
So have you heard from him since the book came out?
I have heard from people around Bannon since the book came out that he was very nervous about it, that he was particularly upset by the fact that his name comes before Donald Trump's name in the subhead. But so far, Trump doesn't seem to have either noticed the book or publicly commented on the fact that Bannon sort of has this newfound prominence. I think because Trump is so embroiled in the Russia scandal and so fixated on Bannon's greatest ally in the administration, which is the Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who he's elaborately criticizing these days. So I think Trump has his attention focused elsewhere, and for as long as he does, I think Bannon probably thinks that's a good thing. Should Trump launch off on some anti-devil's bargain tweet storm, I think Bannon would get very worried.
Earlier this year, there was this period of he's on the outs, Kushner is on the ascent, but Bannon didn't go away. And there was a sense that maybe he was kind of back in favor. This latest Sessions situation seems to suggest otherwise. I mean, is he still a force within the White House?
I think he is. I mean, the interesting thing about Trump and his inner circle is that you're never all the way out. Even after Trump fired Corey Lewandowski, his first campaign manager, he still talked to him on the phone every day, or almost every day, and does to this day still talk to Corey. Even after Paul Manafort left, it was revealed, I think, by the New York Times that he still talked to Manafort pretty regularly. So you're never really all the way out. And Bannon wasn't fired, but he was sort of cast out of the inner circle. But because of this Russia scandal and because of the fact that Bannon so far hasn't been implicated, it's kind of kept him clean and made him one of the few people that Trump can talk to who isn't having to consult with a defense lawyer first to decide we can save the president. The fact that Sessions is in so much trouble, I think, is bad news for Bannon because Sessions as Attorney General has so much power to advance Bannon's nationalist ideas. I don't think that means that Trump is necessarily angry at Bannon, because the proximate cause of his anger at Sessions was the fact that Sessions recused himself from the Russia investigation, which is not something that Bannon was involved with. But I do know that Bannon is very worried about the comments that Trump has made about Sessions, because if Sessions leaves, then Bannon's most powerful ally is suddenly no longer serving as Attorney General.
Have you been surprised by anything that Bannon has done or not done thus far in the administration?
That's a great question. I guess the answer is no, because Bannon always does the same thing for Trump. He tries to whip up this nationalist fervor, and sometimes Trump listens, as when he proposed the travel ban, the executive order, or more recently when he withdrew the U.S. from the Paris Climate Accords. But other times he doesn't listen, like when he stocked his administration with Goldman Sachs staffers. So I think that people sometimes misunderstand the way that Trump is influenced. It isn't necessarily that a certain advisor is suddenly all-powerful. This is the way the media tends to write about it, that a certain advisor is suddenly all-powerful and then he's not. Trump flips between advisors on a daily basis the way he flips between cable stations. And so sometimes Bannon has influence, sometimes he doesn't, sometimes Kushner does, sometimes he doesn't. And the thing that all his advisors try to do, there's a term they use called puppeting, which is essentially, you want to get in there, you want to talk to Trump and fill his head with things right before he makes a decision, in hopes that he'll listen to you and not the guy who comes in after you and tells him something differently. Mm-hmm. So you can see, if you look for it, the mark of Bannon and a lot of things that Trump says, including the big interview he just did with the Times. I was reading some of the excerpts of it this morning, and Trump weirdly goes off on this digression about Napoleon.
I knew you were going to say that.
That is all Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon has a painting of Napoleon in his office. So it's kind of funny. Sometimes when Trump opens his mouth, he'll hate this, but you really can see the marionette strings as he says some of these things. So it's clear that Bannon is in there and being listened to in some capacity.
And also a painting of himself sort of dressed up as Napoleon.
Yes, this is the little nugget that went viral from a book excerpt that New York Magazine ran. And the story behind the painting, I think it also has been a little bit misconstrued. This is a gag gift from Nigel Farage, the British politician who is the kind of the leader of the former UKIP leader who headed up the Brexit campaign, who later became a kind of mascot of the Trump campaign during the closing months, and would go introduce Trump at rallies. Farage is a guy with a very subversive sense of humor, and knowing Bannon's love of history and grandiose self-image, he hired a painter to paint a portrait of Napoleon, but with Bannon's head on it. That is, I believe it's now, one of Bannon's friends told me it's now in his apartment in Arlington, Virginia, but for a while it was in his office in Trump Tower. But it gives you a little glimpse into Bannon's view of himself, I think.
You mentioned that that the media gets this thing wrong about Trump. What do they get wrong about Bannon, do you think?
I think they get two things wrong about Bannon. One, the idea that he's this Machiavelli figure who really influences Donald Trump and gets him to do things that Donald Trump doesn't want to do anyway. I don't think that's right. I don't think anyone in Trump's universe or in his family is really successful, or at least not for very long, in getting him to do something he doesn't want to do. The other thing that I think people get wrong, and this is Bannon's own doing, to view him as the kind of Darth Vader evil figure. Bannon in person and off the record, and pre-Trump especially, is a very funny, charismatic guy. He kind of has the affect of like a 1980s banker, fast talking, always trying to close the deal. I could see immediately why Trump liked him and brought him into his inner circle. But Bannon likes to kind of cultivate an image of the guy behind the curtain, the Oz figure, and so on. And so that's pretty much been the way he's been written about. And I think it hides that one element of him that is really at the heart of the Trump-Bannon relationship.
Is there anything you admire about Bannon?
I admire the fact that he has his own political ideas, even though I disagree with them. My day-to-day life as a Washington reporter is spent talking to people who invariably think the same way. If I'm talking to Republican staffers or policy officials, they've come up through Republican campaigns or think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, and they have very homogenous views. Same is more or less true, a little less true on the Democratic side, but basically, if you're a Democrat, you're a Clinton Democrat, or you were before Bernie came along. There isn't a lot of variability in the kinds of policies that people put together. Bannon, through his weird, strange fascination with religious figures and French intellectuals and all these strange people that I talk about in the book, has cobbled together his own distinct politics, and that's unusual. And it's hard to do that, and then to come into Washington and into the arena and kind of inject that into a presidential race, and to inject it into a presidential race successfully. So I guess you could say that I admire Bannon's efforts to follow his own path, because it's interesting for me to write about as a political journalist in a town where often there aren't interesting things to write about.
All right, this is a serious subject, a dark subject for many people, but I want to end on a kind of light note, which is that you started out writing for The Onion. Do you ever think about like the Onion version of these news events in your mind as a writer?
It's funny. I do, because I started out at The Onion in like 1996. I was mostly an entertainment writer, so I didn't do a ton of the humor. But at the time, it was the 1996 presidential race, and The Onion's shtick. This was Bob Dole versus Bill Clinton, and The Onion's shtick was that Dole was actually a robot. And so for the entire campaign, there would be these, Dole is a robot story. And so I always find myself kind of flashing back subconsciously and thinking, all right, well, what would be the Onion version of Trump? What would be the Onion version of Steve Bannon? Because when the Onion gets a politician right, they get it so right. Their portrayal of Diamond Joe Biden as like a Camaro driving ladies' man. It's the funniest thing in the world. The tough thing, though, with Trump and Bannon, is they're such surreal figures to begin with. It can be difficult to parody them.
I know. We think of the White House reporting team as having a tough job, but imagine what it would be like being at The Onion. That might be the hardest job around in media right now.
I think it absolutely is.
All right. Josh, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
The book again is Devil's Bargain, Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, and the Storming of the Presidency by Joshua Green. Alexandria Marzano-Lesnevich joins us now from Boston to talk about her new book, The Fact of a Body, A Murder and a Memoir. Alexandria, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So this is an intriguing subtitle, A Murder and a Memoir. Can you explain?
Sure. The book actually combines a reinvestigation into a murder committed by a man named Ricky Joseph Langley when he strangled a little boy named Jeremy Guillory in 1992 in a town called Iowa in Louisiana. And it combines that with a memoir of my family.
It's quite a memoir of your family, and I imagine that you deal with them together because there is a link. So let's start with the murder. You were working as a clerk on the legal defense team at the time, or as an intern.
Yes, I was interning with the firm that defended Ricky Langley. I did not work directly on his case, but I had gone to law school at Harvard knowing that I wanted to help fight the death penalty. That was why I had gone. And when the first opportunity came to do so by taking this internship with this law firm in the South, I did so quite enthusiastically. I took that, I went to the South, and I specifically to Louisiana, and I was all ready to fight the death penalty. And then the first thing that happened was actually that I was shown Ricky Joseph Langley's confession tape.
And what was on that confession tape?
On that tape, he described the pleasure he took in molesting children. He was a twice convicted pedophile at that point before the murder, as well as describing killing Jeremy Guillory. And, when I watched that tape, I was 25 years old, very idealistic, totally driven by what I believed and what I wanted to work on in the world. But watching the tape, I suddenly was a child again. Time collapsed. And part of what Ricky Langley described on that tape, part of the actions he described doing were very specifically things that had been done to me when I was a child. Prior to that point, I had really tried to just sort of escape the past. I had tried to pretend that it hadn't happened. It would often bubble up in my life. The memories would often bubble up inside my body. But I kind of kept trying to run from them at that point. And in this tape, kind of this moment happened where I couldn't run from them anymore. There they were right in front of me. There they were inside me. And in that moment, despite what I believed and despite what I wanted to spend my life doing, fighting the death penalty, in that moment, I wanted Ricky Langley to die.
Why do you think you had that response?
I think I had that response because in that moment, he really wasn't a person to me. I think sort of anyone who's been through trauma, sometimes traumatic memories manifest as this kind of overwhelming darkness or this overwhelming sensation that kind of blots everything else out. And when I was watching that tape, that's what happened inside me. Just the horror at sort of what had been done to me when I was a child, and the horror at what this man who I was watching had done, and the fact that he was describing taking pleasure in it. So in that moment, he really wasn't anything else. He was simply what he had done, and for that, in that moment, I wanted him to die. But that very same day that I watched that tape, I learned that Lorelei Guillory, the mother of the child Ricky Langley had murdered, had actually taken the stand at one of his trials and pleaded for Ricky Langley's life. She'd fought to keep him alive. So right away, even back then, and this was in 2003, even back then, it just created this huge question in me as to why she had been able to have that response while I couldn't. And also, is who we are determined by our past, or is who we are determined by what we believe?
So at that point in your life, you're 25 and you wanted to be a lawyer. Had you been consciously thinking about this molestation, or had you suppressed it, or was it something you just kind of kept out of mind?
It was always something I remembered, and it was something that I was open about with romantic partners and kind of when I needed to, but it was something that I often tried to deny the effects of. So at that point, I would still have like a flashback or something like that, and yet I was very determined that it not be allowed to affect me, even as it was affecting me.
When you realized that your response to this murder case had sort of completely overturned your ideals about the death penalty, what did you then think? Like, what was your response to your own response?
Oh, I was horrified by it. I was deeply troubled by it. And, I finished out that summer working for that firm. I actually finished my law degree at Harvard, but I didn't become a lawyer because I kept thinking about the fact that my feelings had changed as soon as the case became personal to me. Mm-hmm. And every case is personal to someone. We have a very adversarial system in which the defense sort of doesn't think as much about the victim, and the prosecution doesn't think as much about what the defendant's been through. And I felt that there was no place for me in that system, in that all or nothing kind of way. And what happened was that I still kept thinking about it even as the years went on. And I noticed that I was haunted by details of the murder. There were details, this BB gun that Jeremy Guillory had, the blue blanket that Ricky Langley wrapped his body in. There were all these details that would come back to me and haunt me unbidden, and that I couldn't shake. But then for years, when I would try to think of the name of the man who had committed the murder, Ricky Langley, I can say now, but when I would try to think of the name back then, it would be gone. All the other details would be there, but it would be just snipped from my consciousness. In those days, I could, literally look at a newspaper article about the case, and as soon as I put it down, his name would be gone. And there is only one other such moment of perfect pinpoint blackness in my life where I remember everything else around it, and I don't remember that one thing. And that has to do with my grandfather.
What had your grandfather done?
What had he done?
Mm-hmm.
He had molested myself and my sisters for 5 years.
And how old were you?
As far as I can tell, I was about 3 when it started, and I was 8 when it ended.
What was that one thing, that one black spot, as you mentioned, with your grandfather, that the case brought up for you?
He asked me if I forgave him. And I remember everything else about that moment. I remember being in my parents' kitchen alone. The phone rang. For other reasons, I knew when the phone rang, I knew it was him. And I remember picking up the phone, and I remember the sound of his voice. And I remember what else he said, but I don't remember how I answered him.
Do you forgive him?
I think it's a very complicated question because forgiveness often has this element of erasure to it. Lorelei Guillory has been very adamant in interviews that she does not forgive Ricky Langley, but that she did not want him to die. And I was very struck by that duality when I first read it, because I think that speaks to something we don't often make room for. In discourse, we often have this idea that to forgive means to forget. Forgive and forget. And that somehow perhaps forgiveness will erase the harm. And it doesn't. And what I wanted was to make room for this complicated duality. I wanted to be able to understand that Ricky Langley was a murderer, but also a person. And my grandfather was a pedophile, but also my grandfather. And that's kind of where I ended up, which is maybe a more complicated place than the word forgiveness always allows.
And one of the troubling things about the story is that your parents were both lawyers and they both knew. What was their response?
Well, they didn't know while it was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as they did know, they prevented him from ever spending the night. But they also forbade us from talking about it and from confronting him, which I've learned is actually quite common in families. And part of the reason I wanted to write this book is because I think we often try to get away from the past just by putting a clamp down on it, being silent about it, trying to pretend that it didn't happen. But our bodies remember, our bodies know. I never lost the memories. I always had the memories. And part of my question in this book was sort of, could I find a way to live with the story? Could I find a way to live with what had happened that allowed both things to be true, where I saw sort of why my parents had made the choices they had, the way that the choices that they made were to try to keep our family together, but that I also resisted the erasure of what had happened in the past. And one of the things that really struck me when I got that first set of court records was that I really wasn't alone in that problem. What I saw over and over again in the records was people reacting very personally and very emotionally to the murder because it reminded them of stories in their own family that in many cases had been clamped down or suppressed. And I started to see basically that I wasn't alone in seeing my life in this story, but also that my family wasn't alone in the question of how to handle the past. And trying to capture that was part of what drew me to write this book.
When you look back and you think about what should your parents have done, what should their response have been when they found out?
I don't really have a feeling of they should have done this or they should have done this other thing. Part of what was really striking for me, again, in writing this book, because I think there's no question that I was going into Ricky Langley's story looking for answers I couldn't find in my own, was that as I began to read these 30,000 pages of records and everyone in Ricky Langley's story began to seem like people to me, began to seem real. I had these moments when Ricky as a teenager would try to turn himself in, try to get help. And it was unavoidable reading those moments that he would become more real to me and I would have to think about who he was. That forced me to see my parents more fully, actually, right? If I was going to empathize with this murderer, with this child molester, how could I not think about what my parents' reasons were for making the decisions that they had? How could I not understand that they were more complicated? How could I not understand that everyone in this story was more complicated? So what that led me to do, what actually looking into Ricky Langley's family forced me to do, was look into my own family and start to understand how much my parents had going on at that time, how much they were trying to deal with, how much grief they were trying to deal with. I have a sister who had passed away. And I really think that they made the choices that to them at the time seemed like the best choices that they could. But I want to make room for that and also make room to still say, and they acted out of love, and it still did harm.
And what about your grandfather? Did writing the book and exploring the story of this other molester make you more empathetic towards him, or did you understand him better?
I don't know that I'll ever understand him, but it did make me think about who else he was. And holding that complicated duality where I was able to sort of remember the moments when I was a child when he taught me to draw. When he talked to me about being an artist, when he talked to me, because he was an artist, and when he talked to me about how much I liked writing, I was able to admit those stories into my idea of who he was, admit rather those memories into my idea of who he was, when for so long he had just simply in my memory been the man who molested me. But what was important to me was to be able to hold both. Because certainly in my family, there was this idea, he was a grandfather and we're not going to talk about the fact that he was a child molester. And for so long in my memories, it was, he was a child molester, and I'm not going to think about the way he was also a grandfather, because it was too hard to acknowledge that he had been both. And so where I ended up was this place where it actually feels really important to acknowledge that he was both.
Last question, and perhaps one of the biggest questions, obviously the thing that ties these two stories together, among other things, is pedophilia. What conclusions did you come away with about the way in which people handle situations of pedophilia and mistakes that we might make in the way that we do that?
One of my dearest hopes for this book is that people will talk more about what they struggle with and also what has happened in their own lives. One of the things I have seen since the book came out is just how common these kinds of stories are in families. People keep reaching out to me to talk about what's happened in their past, or they say, this exact thing didn't happen in my past, but something else did, and here's how my family handled it. We didn't talk about it. And that result is that I think a lot of people end up feeling alone when they're really not. At the same time, the secrecy kind of doesn't help anything. It sort of allows, in many cases, allows the abuse to continue, but also I think in many cases it prevents getting people the help they need. So I think in some ways the secrecy compounds the stigma, both the stigma of the abused and the stigma of the abuser. I want to clarify that, of course, I think that child abuse is incredibly horrible. But I do think that we need to acknowledge that these people are people in order to be able to get them effective treatment. The secrecy that results from the extreme stigma on both sides just kind of isn't helping anyone.
Okay, very, very difficult subjects to take up in a book, a very brave book. Alexandria, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
The book again is called The Fact of a Body, A Murder and a Memoir by Alexandria Marzano-Lesnevich. Laura Dassow Walls is a professor of English at the University of Notre Dame, and she is the author of a new biography of Henry David Thoreau. She joins us now, fittingly, from Concord, Massachusetts. Laura, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So you say in the sort of press material accompanying your book that the Thoreau that you sought was not in any book, and that's why you decided to write this one. What was the Thoreau that you were looking for? Or who was the Thoreau?
I found the Thoreau in the books that I was reading about him, a very interesting person, but I came to Thoreau, first of all, through reading his journals. And then I did a long study of Emerson and some of the people around Thoreau, transcendentalists and others, the women in his life. It struck me that what I was reading and what I had seen in books about Thoreau didn't quite match up. So I had read, of course, as we all do, that he was a loner and a misanthrope and went off into the woods and was a hermit. And when I was very young, I found that person very attractive and kind of rebellious. But he was somebody who collaborated with projects that interested him and did try to be a good contributing citizen, even though he also protected his time for his creative work. And that sense of him as an engaged, involved person in the community struck me as something that I hadn't known. And the more I understood about the community and his role in it, the more I was struck that there was another story here that might help us today when we're trying to think how to build and to rebuild communities. And I thought, this is a story that we could use hearing. And it was the Thoreau that I came to know through as I say, the historical and the primary records.
I mean, it's hard to imagine that there have been no major biographies of Thoreau in 50 years. Why do you think that is?
I've wondered about that. I think that Walter Harding's biography, which came out in 1965, was so commanding in all the sheer just chronicling everything that we knew about him, of course, as of 1965, that it sort of became a standard biography that everybody referred to, and Harding himself said in the 80s he was surprised that nobody had taken up the task of telling the narrative. And I was really surprised watching 2017 sort of approach about going on 10 years ago, thinking somebody must be doing this. Maybe it's a task I could take on. And finally deciding that it was a task I not only could but had to take on.
Was there any new material, any new archival material or research available to you that was not available to previous biographers?
There are quite a few letters that have surfaced in recent decades, and they're all being published now. The first volume is out. The second and third volumes are about to be out. This is coming out through Princeton University Press. There are some interesting collections in archives, especially here in Concord at the Concord Free Public Library. Some of them are new, as in letters back and forth from friends that have insights into the time and place.
I think when most Americans think of Thoreau, the same things come up. They think of civil disobedience, of Walden, of transcendentalism, of the image you mentioned earlier of the loner in the woods. But I don't know that we have a good sense of his life, which was relatively short. Tell us about what his childhood was like.
He was born on a farm, and you can go visit it today. It's still there. He was born right on the heels of the so-called year without a summer, when an Indonesian volcano had erupted and changed the atmospheric chemistry of the planet so much that temperatures had dropped about 1 degree Fahrenheit. And this was enough to completely destroy the summer cycling, and a lot of crops failed across New England especially. It was a worldwide phenomenon. So a lot of farmers left, and that included Thoreau's family. Eventually, by chance, Thoreau's uncle discovered a graphite mine up in New Hampshire, and Concord was a center of the very young pencil industry. And John Thoreau, the father, realized that if he could get rights to using this graphite, he could join the pencil manufacturers in Concord, and that's exactly what they did. At this point, Henry was still quite young, so he did the sort of conscious growing up years here in Concord, and of course that became his home. Pretty conventional childhood, really, going to the town schools, and then because he showed some academic talent, his family wanted to send one of their sons to Harvard, which was a stretch for them because Harvard was expensive and they were just, they were not prosperous yet. So they scrimped and saved and sent their son to Harvard, where he was a scholarship student. When he came back, he found that Ralph Waldo Emerson had moved in just down the street, this commanding intellectual figure. And Thoreau had already begun to imagine himself as potentially a commanding intellectual figure. So there was an interesting relationship there. It was the best thing that could have happened to him in terms of connecting with a world-class intellectual. But of course, the rivalry between the two, I think that it sharpened each other's minds in interesting ways. You can see Thoreau's influence on Emerson as well.
And so did Thoreau look to him as a mentor or strictly competition?
At first, very much a mentor. Mm-hmm. He had just come out of Harvard and was at that phase trying to figure out what his path would be in life. He moves in with the Emerson family as a handyman and assistant, editorial assistant. So that's a very close relationship. Emerson has a kind of concept for what Thoreau should be. And the more Thoreau grows into his own voice, the more he feels that Emerson's concept for him isn't quite the concept he wants for himself. It's interesting because there is no model for him. He has a kind of visceral sense that poetry and literature isn't wild enough, that there should be a relationship to the land and what we would call nature. And so That there isn't a model for it means that he has to spend some time figuring out what it is that he means when he thinks this and says this. And, he needs to break away with Emerson to really find that voice. And he does.
One of the shocking publishing facts about Thoreau is that Walden only sold 2,000 copies during his lifetime. When did the work get the credit and readership that it, subsequently enjoyed?
It was a long, steady process. Walden actually the initial sales were promising, and it got very well reviewed in the United States and in Great Britain. And so it created a kind of initial burst of approval. But it's not an easy book. So after a certain period of time, it kind of slumped. A number of people were becoming more deeply interested in his name and reputation, so his work slowly entered publication in new editions through the 1860s. The circle starts to expand around 1900, so this long process begun by his friends to keep his name, and his sister Sophia Thoreau, to keep his name alive, just has to take about 2 generations before that devoted circle of friends, their good work in getting his works out there, finally germinates into a kind of worldwide fame, starting in the early 20th century, and then it just keeps going from there.
What was your impression going into this book that perhaps changed during the research and writing process? Did you come away having any new concept of him at the end of writing this book?
Yeah, I was very moved and surprised to discover how many times in his life he either failed abysmally or became very ill. And then the rebound, when he reorients, he comes back reborn with such strength and such vitality, and it's a pattern he repeats 4 or 5 times after the death of his brother John, for instance, in 1842, which sends him into a deep, deep depression. And he comes back and, again, has this tremendous surge of creativity. So this pattern of life sort of bringing him down to a point where he loses faith in himself briefly and then recovers and rebounds with a supercharged energy and a whole creative burst that then gives him immense confidence. And that's one reason why his death is such a tragedy, that if he'd only lived that little bit longer, we would have seen that next phase of his creative work. And it would have been quite different, but it would have been very exciting.
Oh, well, much to contemplate on the 200th anniversary of his birth. Laura, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Laura Dassow Walls is the author of a new biography, Henry David Thoreau, A Life. Joining us now, Greg Coles, John Williams, and Parl Sagel talking about what we're reading. Hi, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
All right, let's start with you, Parl.
So my go-to books on planes are sort of magazine profiles stitched together. You can kind of get in and out. It's kind of gossipy. And I'm just back from vacation, and I was reading Cleopatra's Nose by Judith Thurman. Have you guys read this?
No.
Oh, it's so good. And like my favorite thing about this book is that she cares about things that I don't care about, like food and fashion, but I can read about them endlessly when Thurman is writing about it. She's really good on power and femininity, and
They're essays?
They're essays. They're really sort of like sensually written, and yeah, she's just like a really fun person to spend some time with.
What's your favorite essay?
About Vanessa Beeman. Do you know her? She's this very strange, very complicated artist who sort of uses her own body and the bodies of her mothers and women in her family to sort of do these very strange tableaux. But highly recommend if you are looking for something fun and sort of very impressive. John, what about you?
I'll be quick because I finished Priest Daddy by Patricia Lockwood, which I talked about the past couple of weeks and which I would still just highly recommend. I've emphasized how funny it is, which it is, but she's also very lyrical, and especially as the book goes on, she sort of gets deeper into certain subjects like faith. And there's a great paragraph about Emily Dickinson and her sort of solitary contemplation. There's even a very sort of sympathetic and poetic paragraph about these pro-life supporters who she comes upon. So Priest Daddy I would put on a top list. And now I'm reading something that Jen talked about last week, which is Emmanuel Carrera's
Everybody in the Office
memoir, Lives Other Than My Own, which the only thing I'll add to what Jen said about it starts during the tsunami in Sri Lanka and then moves on to other grim subjects. But the tone is just so matter of fact that it makes it very moving. And it also reminds me a little bit of Knausgaard, because there's that sort of one thing after another effect. And I think he's a better stylist than Knausgaard, but I would so far recommend that. I'm about 75 pages
next
in.
on my list, too.
Everybody in the Office.
Everyone is reading
Jen
Carrera.
Salai did it to us.
So we'll continue.
No, it's Barry Gouen who
Well,
did
he
this.
was the
But
initiator.
Jen talked about it on the podcast last week
And
at
so
length.
now we all...
Yeah, so
Now we
we'll
all have
continue
to
our
read
book
it.
club, our Carrera book club next week. Greg, what about you? Oh, that's a good one.
So I'm reading. I have returned to Grace Paley. It's an edition of her stories. It's the collected stories that I don't own. I own a lot of her individual. I think all of her individual collections.
That's cool.
But this
Let me
is
see the jacket. Which one
this
is
is
it?
the collected stories. It shows
that's my
Paley
favorite. I
herself
love
on the
that
cover
photo
with
of
her
her.
little dandelion puff of hair. It's it's a great photo, and she's just such a delightful writer. I got this version from the library because I was looking for a specific quote that I couldn't find in my books at home. And it turns out the quote comes from the preface to this. She wrote when the collected stories came out, she wrote a little essay about how she started as a writer. And the quote that I was looking for, it's just one sentence, but it's 2 ears, one for literature, one for home, are useful for writers. And that just captures Grace Paley for me. She's got 1 foot, 1 ear in the whole history of literature that preceded her, and the other in what she calls kind of the home language of Russian and Yiddish. And her stories are so voice driven. So I picked it up for the preface, and you can't just kind of stop reading. Then it's once you start reading her, you just fall into this whole
We're just beaming
world.
at Greg, by the way.
Yeah, we're all very happy with that one.
Staring at you moonily. We're all kind of jealous of your book right now. It's very good.
Pamela, what are you reading?
Well, I had that same experience of when you dip into something and then you can't get out. But I can't talk too much about the book that I did just finish this morning because it is embargoed, which in the business means that no one can read it, see it, touch it, talk about it, anything.
So now we all have to guess.
Until it all comes out. No, I'll tell you what it is. It's coming out this fall, and it has been swiftly sent off out of the office to its intended reviewer. The book is Tina Brown's Vanity Fair diaries, and so these are diaries of her years being the editor of Vanity Fair and sort of the immediate period before. And so that much has been announced. I can say that. And I can say also that this manuscript, this spiral bound big chunk of a thing, arrived under, a cloak of darkness, and I intended to immediately pass it on, but I made the mistake of opening it up and reading one page and then realizing I'm going to have to keep reading that. And now I'm going to have to go back to the beginning. I'm going to have to read the entire thing until it can leave the office. And so that's what I did.
A little bit of a fall preview. You'll be talking about it again probably.
Yeah, we can discuss it back in the fall. All right, guys. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.